Hello, and welcome to this Future Foreign Policy Series event entitled A New Nuclear Era. I'm Christopher Preble, co-director of the Atlantic Council's New American Engagement Initiative, the organizer and host of today's discussion. Recently, some scholars and policymakers have proclaimed that the world is entering a new nuclear era. The post-Cold War nuclear order appears to be deteriorating. Some states are demonstrating an interest in developing nuclear weapons if they don't have them, and others are expanding their arsenals if they already do. Russia's brutal war in Ukraine could be a critical inflection point. With provocative rhetoric, Putin has brandished threats concerning Russia's nuclear weapons to deter others from becoming more deeply involved in the war that he initiated. But how credible are Putin's claims? Would he be willing to use nuclear weapons either in Ukraine or beyond? The world is watching. What lessons will China, South Korea, Japan, and others learn from Ukraine? Could we see nuclear proliferation in the Indo-Pacific? What are the prospects that the nuclear taboo might end? To answer these critical questions, I'm very excited to introduce a panel of experts on this possible new nuclear age. First up is Dr. Naoko Aoki. Dr. Aoki is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Asia Security Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and a research associate at the University of Maryland's Center for International and Security Studies. Dr. Aoki is an expert in East Asian political and security issues, including topics such as the North Korean nuclear program, U.S. alliances in Asia, and defense in the Indo-Pacific. Next up, we have Daryl Press. Dr. Daryl Press, he's a professor of government at Dartmouth College. Dr. Press is also an expert on nuclear deterrence, also U.S. nuclear national security policy, and the evolution of technology and warfare. With Keir Lieber, Dr. Press is the author of the book, The Myth of the Nuclear Revolution, Power Politics in the Atomic Age. Finally, we have Dr. Tong Xiao, a senior fellow in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as a visiting research scholar at Princeton University's Science and Global Security program. Dr. Xiao's research focuses on security issues such as nuclear weapons policy, deterrence, arms control, nonproliferation, and China's security and foreign policy. Moderating the conversation today will be Adam Taylor, foreign news reporter for the Washington Post. His reporting has covered a variety of critical issues, including Russia's war in Ukraine and new developments in the Indo-Pacific. Our thanks to the panelists for joining us today, and to Adam for moderating, and to you for tuning in. Through the Future Foreign Policy series, the New American Engagement Initiative aims to provide new perspectives on pressing challenges that the United States faces. I'm confident this event will do just that. And a quick reminder to those of you in our virtual audience, please put any questions for the panelists in the Q&A function in Zoom. We will get those. We'll get to those later in the program. With that, over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you very much for having me today. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to the Atlantic Council in general. It's a big subject, so let's start with perhaps the sort of obvious question. And this will be to all of our panelists. I was wondering, when you were watching the outbreak of the war and how it's progressed over the last 6 months, how serious of a risk did you think that nuclear weapons posed? Could they have been used? Could a taboo have been broken? And why did you come to that sort of conclusion or that feeling? Dr. Aoki, could we ask you that first?
Of course. Hello, and thank you to all of you, including the audience today, for coming. And so I think that Russia, as we know, Russia has has been making nuclear threats both explicitly and implicitly throughout the war. And in addition, we're worried about whether Russia would take smaller steps on the nuclear escalation ladder, like nuclear demonstrations, employment of limited nuclear employment. And it has not taken that step yet, and hopefully it won't. I think the concern was more acute earlier in the war, but I think the threat is still there, and I'm concerned, and I think this is an event that has implications for other parts of the world as well.
Thank you very much. And the same question to Dr. Press.
When I think about this, it seems to me that the likelihood of Russian nuclear employment in the war is largely a function of two things. Number one, the Putin administration's perception of the likelihood that the war will lead to a real threat to the survival of their regime, number one. And number two, the extent to which they think that NATO, including US action, is at the root of that threat. If they perceive that NATO actions are leading to war outcomes that fundamentally threaten the survival of the Putin regime, I think they will walk themselves through a list of coercive escalatory options, including things like more severe energy cutoff, but which include nuclear weapons as a serious and a very real possibility.
Thank you. And Dr. Xiao, what's your thoughts on the same subject?
I think the absolute risk of nuclear use is growing slightly, although relatively speaking, the risk remains low. As the war develops into a protracted long-term conflict, I think there might be less opportunities for Russia to threaten escalation. But I think we will enter into uncharted water if the war coincides with some type of internal instability in Russia. That's why I think a Russian leader will see this as an existential threat, at least to the leadership. Of course, it also depends on how US policy manifests. There is discussion that US appears to prefer even conventional response in the scenario of a limited Russian nuclear use. That's extremely irresponsible on the American side. On the other side, some people worry that might perhaps embolden Russian consideration of nuclear signal and perhaps even nuclear demonstration use. So regardless whether nuclear weapons will be used, it will, I think, lead to deeper discussions across the world about the role of nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much. This is a question to Dr. Press. It's sort of a counter argument in some ways. We were all talking about sort of Putin's saber rattling about nuclear weapons, in this March, the second month of the war, really the first month. And of course, Putin hasn't used a nuclear weapon. There hasn't been that much sort of talk about that even in months. And does that sort of not show that the nuclear taboo has, at least to some extent, held? And also, has Putin lost credibility by sort of making these sort of threats and then sort of backing away? What is the sort of calculation that has to go through his head right now?
The way I would approach such questions is that trying to get into the mind of a single leader, whether it's Vladimir Putin or someone else, I think is a very, very difficult and ultimately very, very subjective business. And it will lead 50 different analysts who are well informed to draw 50 different conclusions. What I try to do is ask myself, how have nuclear armed countries thought about using and plan to use nuclear weapons throughout the nuclear age? And I think there's actually a very strong pattern there, one which we have ignored over the past 20 years to our unhappiness now, which is that countries who are, number one, militarily weak relative to their adversaries, and number two, face the prospect of major conventional defeat in an important war to them, they tend to rely on nuclear escalatory threats to try to stalemate their adversaries. That's Pakistan's explicit nuclear doctrine today. It's North Korea's explicit nuclear doctrine today. It was NATO's nuclear doctrine for decades of the Cold War. And so when I see the Russian government making nuclear threats that they're linking to potential NATO conventional escalation, I don't see this as sign that we have an aberration here. I see it as a sign that Russia is dusting off the same nuclear coercive toolkit that we used for decades and that almost everybody else who's been in that position has used. So I don't see this as either a sign that Russia is unusual or that they're stepping now away from nuclear weapons, I still think we face the fundamental situation, which is if we force them into a corner where their regime is at risk, then we shouldn't be surprised if they break out those nuclear threats again or go further.
Obviously, a lot of the attention on nuclear weapons recently has focused on Europe for obvious reasons. Ukraine is in Europe. But of course, there are nuclear states in East Asia, and we are lucky to have some preeminent experts in East Asian nuclear weapons with us. I wondered if we could get some of your reaction about how these countries may be viewing what's happening in Ukraine in relation to nuclear weapons. Perhaps Dr. Aoki, we could talk about North Korea first.
Of course. So I think for North Korea, North Korea watches events like these very closely, I think. And but on the other hand, North Korea is continuing steadily with its own nuclear weapons program. According to a 5-year plan that they came up with, they laid out in January 2021. They have been steadily moving forward with this. And while this event in Ukraine, the Ukrainian war, probably reinforces in the North Korean mind the necessity of nuclear weapons, because again, this is a country, Ukraine is a country that gave up Soviet era nuclear weapons. They were supposed to they had a security guarantee, but this was what happened. And so in the North Korean mind, this is yet another reason why it should continue on the current path. And I think that's exactly what it's doing. It has not held a nuclear test since 2017, but it has held more than 30 missile tests this year. So it's continuing with its missile and nuclear development.
And Dr. Zhao, could we talk about China? And of course, China has been a subject of a lot of debate and discussion during the Ukraine conflict, in particular in relation to Taiwan and how it's gauging the reactions of Western powers through how they respond to Ukraine. Do you think that the sort of reaction we've seen to Russian nuclear threats is something that China is going to actively learn from?
I think the Chinese strategists, when they watched Russian nuclear saber rattling, they see that it mostly worked. The nuclear signals from Russia did appear to make NATO countries be much more careful in thinking about what types of weapons, military support, or even economic sanctions they can provide to Ukraine and impose on Russia. So it helped achieve the Russian goal of dissuading NATO countries from coming to Ukraine's defense. I think this coincides with increasing internal trend in China in recent years, where the current paramount leader seems to believe that nuclear weapons, in addition, can help maintain nuclear stability between China and its nuclear rivals, can also contribute to maintaining political level stability between especially China and the United States. As you know, our previous speaker said, nuclear use is only considered when a regime is under existential threat, but China feels it is under increasing critical level existential threat from the United States, with its aim on undermining the Chinese system and perhaps increasingly interested in some type of direct or indirect regime change. So I think this will strengthen the Chinese belief that nuclear weapons and a bigger nuclear arsenal can help counter the political level perceived American hostility and maintain political level stability. Another, I think, important lesson China is learning is, the Russian nuclear signaling is viewed as a very, is being exercised very smartly. Russia did not really expressly say nuclear threats. It used the nuclear drills, exercises, tests of nuclear capable delivery systems. A Russian TV showed the Russian nuclear suitcase. So I think the lesson for China is in the future confrontation between China and the West, China doesn't really need to explicitly issue nuclear threats. China can just refer to nuclear weapons in indirect and vague ways, and even that can help achieve the security benefits of deterring and dissuading, political and military threats below the nuclear level, and that would be really helpful in the Taiwan Strait contingency.
Thank you very much. We don't know how this war is going to end. But there is a possibility that when it ends, we could see countries seek to deploy nuclear weapons to allied states, sort of a Cold War redux type situation. And there may be demands from allied states to have weapons deployed to them, both in Europe and East Asia. I wondered whether you felt that was the sort of potential likely next step, and whether that poses new threats or threats that are actually different than the Cold War era because of the different alliances and different nature of the geopolitical world. Dr. Press, maybe you could start with that one.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I would slightly reframe it though and ask the question: what does the Ukraine war reveal about the continued logic and the continued strength of the US strategy of extended nuclear deterrence around the world? There are many US allies around the world in Europe and East Asia who rely on US nuclear promises as a substitute for their own nuclear arsenals. And that's been both a tool to prevent nuclear war, which is terrific, and also to prevent proliferation principally of our allies. The question is, does the Ukraine war reveal fundamental tensions or worse, fundamental problems with this strategy in the 21st century? And I would argue that there's two factors which should, and I know are, making allies around the world rethink their reliance on US nuclear threats. One of them is that in many or perhaps most of the regions where we extend deterrence threats, local countries, including our adversaries, to be frank, care more about the outcome of the conflict than we do. The United States cares a lot about the outcome of the Ukraine war, arguably not as much as Russia does. The United States would care a lot about the outcome of a war on the Korean Peninsula, arguably not as much as the North Korean government does. And so in a situation where there's an imbalance of stakes, the challenge of extending nuclear deterrence gets harder and harder. So that's number one. Number two, and now I'm thinking about North Korea in particular, North Korea is developing the capability to reliably threaten the US homeland with nuclear retaliatory strikes, which fundamentally changes the balance of risks in any confrontation. And smart analysts in South Korea, smart analysts in Japan are asking themselves the very wise and necessary question, which is, in the future, in the midst of a major war in our region, would the United States really risk its own destruction to protect us from regional threats? And if the answer is no, do we as the South Korean government or do we as the Japanese government need to look for alternative approaches to provide for our own deterrence? The Ukraine war certainly highlights that problem, but the problem is not coming from the Ukraine war. It's coming from this imbalance of interests and this growing ability of adversaries to actually reach the US homeland. And that's a problem we need to address.
Great answer. Dr. Aoki, I wonder if I could get your take on that. What sort of discussions are happening in South Korea and Japan about the nuclear umbrella or the need for nuclear weapons on their own soil? What do you think the takeaways are right now?
Sure. I think the Ukrainian war has injected new momentum in the debate, particularly in South Korea, but also in Japan as well. And the three options that usually are discussed are the redeployment of US tactical nuclear weapons. The United States had nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula for about 30 years until 1991. The US also stationed nuclear weapons in Okinawa from the late 1950s to 1972, when the Okinawa's control was reverted back to Japan, for example. That's one. And the second one that's usually discussed is nuclear sharing, the kind of nuclear sharing agreement that NATO has with the United States. So that would be placing US nuclear weapons in US ally soil. And although the United States has ultimate control over those nuclear weapons. And then there is the indigenous nuclear development. So those are the three that are usually discussed. And I think the discussions are more thorough in South Korea than in Japan, because Japan has had this taboo on discussing nuclear weapons for a very long time, although that has changed over the last 20 years or so. Mainstream responsible, policymakers and scholars discuss nuclear weapons these days in Japan as well, but the discussions have not been as broad and open as they have been in South Korea. And there's a difference in opinions, public opinion as well, because South Korean public is generally supportive of nuclear having nuclear weapons on South Korean soil, whereas the Japanese public is not. So there's a very big difference between the two. And of course, there are pros and cons as to whether to have nuclear weapons on your own territory. And I could get into the specifics of that, but generally in Japan, for example, generally still, I think the idea is that if the United States extended nuclear deterrence is credible, then it does not make sense for Japan to have its own nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Zhao, I wondered if I could ask pretty much the same question of you, but I would really be interested in also how you think Taiwan would fall into these sort of debates about particularly the nuclear umbrella.
Sure, thank you. I think the situation in Europe and Asia are a little different. In Europe, I think is the near-term uncertainty is whether Russia would actually deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus. And Russia itself, after the Ukraine war, is perhaps going to be more reliant on nuclear weapons, given its much weakened conventional forces. So the question is whether US allies in Europe would also want more direct involvement in nuclear sharing for stronger deterrence. But there's also still the hope that perhaps some quick start of arms control talks, just like what happened after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and also following the Soviet invasion into Afghanistan, those crises did actually prompt greater interest in arms control talks. So there is hope that these discussions, if happen quickly, may be able to contain that trajectory. In the Asia-Pacific region, I think many of the US allies, they are worried about nuclear threats from North Korea, but they worry about the conventional threats from China. And here in particular, the so-called stability-instability paradox is very strong on their mind, meaning that a stable US-China nuclear relationship or mutual deterrence relationship at the nuclear level could embolden Chinese conventional level military aggression against American allies. And in this regard, looking forward, perhaps their concern about China's conventional threat is only going to deepen because China appears very determined to further build up its power, conventional power, and better exercise its conventional military power. And Taiwan contingency certainly will, the Taiwan scenario will further increasing regional concerns. The Chinese conventional military capabilities aimed at addressing the Taiwan Strait issue will also be able to be used against other US allies, at least from their perspective. So I think this means we need to think of better ways to contain the real and increasing threat of proliferation, not necessarily in a very explicit way, but I think more countries will be interested in developing hedging capabilities against the future uncertainties.
Hey, Adam, could I build on something that that Dr. Aoki said, and actually both panelists did? I think both panelists are right that there's a quite different level of interest in exploring some element of enhanced nuclear deterrence capabilities across U.S. partners and allies across East Asia. And I think Dr. Aoki is exactly right that the interest in this seems highest in South Korea. I would just put two other thoughts on the table that I've observed in recent interactions with South Koreans on this topic. Number one is over the past 5 or 6 years, meaning well before the Russia-Ukraine war, South Korea has made a series of very substantial military investments in conventional weapons whose procurement is very unusual if their purpose was not additionally to provide a hedging possibility for an indigenous South Korean nuclear force. The biggest example being their conventional ballistic missile submarines, which exist. There are a variety of reasons we can talk about why that's a very unusual choice if they're not thinking about nuclear hedging. So I think Dr. Aoki's right. This is not in the level of idle chatter among South Korean political elite. There are serious and expensive decisions already being made by the South Korean government. The second thing is, I think Dr. Aoki also really nailed it in laying out the options on the table that South Koreans discuss about what more nuclear capability might look like. But something which is often missing from the debate is the following. If the way you diagnose the problem is that the US nuclear deterrent is becoming less credible, why? Because of the increasing range and reliability of North Korean nuclear forces. If the way you define the problem is that the source is the reduced credibility of the US nuclear arsenal, then neither the forward deployment of US nuclear weapons nor Korean nuclear sharing even address the problem, let alone solve it. And the reason is because for well more than a decade now, several decades, all US nuclear forces are equipped with very sophisticated locks that are not just tamper resistant, they're designed to disable the weapon if it's tampered with. And the meaning of that is that US nuclear forces deployed in South Korea, whether under complete US command or whether under a nuclear sharing agreement, could not be used without the decision of the US president. And therefore, if the root of the problem is South Koreans understandably are starting to doubt the credibility of US nuclear assurances, frankly, a US nuclear response, whether it's from Minot Air Force Base or Osan Air Force Base, is equally as credible. We can do it, but we sure as heck might wish not to. So of those three choices, I think people are looking at all three that Dr. Aoki described. The folks who are digging into this more at a technical level are realizing, I think, that either you continue to rely on the extended US nuclear deterrent and hope for the best, despite North Korean capabilities, or alternatively, you start thinking about a legal, transparent turn toward an independent nuclear capability.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I would love to actually hear Dr. Aoki and Dr. Zhao's sort of response to that. And in terms of non-proliferation, are we just going to see more states, whether they're in East Asia or anywhere else, move towards developing their own nuclear weapons, not just as a result of the Ukraine conflict, of course, but also as a result of the longer-term trends that Dr. Press mentioned?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and so I think I will first talk about the differences. There are a couple of differences between Japan and South Korea. The short answer to your question, I should say first, is that we don't know yet, and we do not know yet. The drivers for the question of whether to have your own nuclear capability I think there are two major elements here. One is the perception of the threat, which differ between Japan and South Korea, because for South Korea, the major threat is North Korea, which is nuclear armed right on the border. Whereas for Japan, North Korea is obviously a big problem, and Japan has been living under this possibility of a North Korean missile armed with a nuclear weapon coming to Japan. So that is a problem, but for Japan, the central challenge is China. And when you look at the problems that Japan is concerned about, at least in the immediate future, they're like the possibility of a Taiwan Strait crisis, the conflict over the Senkaku Islands, known to the Chinese as Diaoyu Islands, and whether the question of whether having your own nuclear weapons will help with those threats are open to question. And there are other issues, like if you develop your own nuclear weapons, there will be a time between the time when you decide to do that and when you actually have a capable force that you can defend yourself with. And assuming that the United States, assuming that the United States do not want their allies to go nuclear, then the Japan and South Korea may be forfeiting their security guarantee. So that makes them vulnerable for quite a chunk of time. So there are various reasons why these cons might cancel out the benefits. There's also another, so that's number one, the interest or rather perception of threat. And the second important element is what Dr. Press said, the US credibility, the credibility of US nuclear deterrence. And so whether that is credible or not is a key to this question as well.
I very much agree with the other speakers. I do think the risk is very real for more proliferation development in the region. If we want to reduce such risks, I think it really requires major power cooperation. It requires their cooperation to jointly slow down North Korea's nuclear development. It requires the major powers to jointly create bigger costs for additional countries to pursue nuclear weapons. Like the greatest deterrent against countries like South Korea, Japan, Australia, so to speak, to go nuclear is to impose tremendous political, reputational, economic costs. And this requires major power cooperation. It also requires China be more willing to address the conventional security concerns of American allies in East Asia, to have a broader regional discussion to discuss conventional level security issues. And so ultimately, for China and Russia, which certainly have a very important influence in affecting this future trend, what is important to these countries is whether the US and Western countries are really demonstrating their real commitment to non-proliferation, whether they are being more giving their own allies greater room to develop controversial capabilities, or even tacitly allow them to pursue a nuclear hedging capacity. The current debate is, of course, over AUKUS, whether that is whether it's a hidden agenda to provide Australia with a nuclear weapon capability in the future. That's the real concern. It may not be reasonable from the Western perspective, but China seems genuinely worried about that possibility. If US and other countries can reduce that Chinese concern in such cases, maybe that will help bring China and other countries like Russia on board to jointly address the broader trend of global proliferation.
Thanks, and that's a good segue for my next question. How does non-proliferation efforts how do they go now? I mean, things have changed a lot over the last few decades. The bright spot that was the sort of agreements between Washington and Russia is pretty much gone now. Of course, China is a huge player that the West is going to need to have in some kind of non-proliferation talks in some way. What is the future for this? I mean, how can this happen when the three biggest nuclear powers in the world have such bad relations? And also, how do any future talks address sort of new fears that have come up throughout this conflict, such as the use of nuclear weapons in a demonstration, or so-called tactical nuclear weapons, or lower yield nuclear weapons, and how those would fit into ongoing talks? Dr. Press, maybe I could talk with you first.
You're asking, I think, all the right questions. Let me put one thought on the table that's in a little bit of a different direction, and then come back exactly to what we've been discussing. The thought on the table is that the best solutions for South Korea, best solutions for the region, best solutions for the world, from the challenges that are being created by North Korean development of better and better nuclear capabilities, those are difficult challenges. The more difficult and more dangerous ones are the ones that I think we're a half step away on the other side of the world, namely the potential proliferation consequences of Iranian nuclear proliferation, which is rapidly moving from possibility to plausibility. And as difficult as it is that we all talk through the consequences of South Korean independent nuclear capabilities or Japanese, it will be a whole lot more difficult when the countries who are our partners, who are asking for credible nuclear protection, are not the very sophisticated, very capable, democratic South Korean and Japanese allies, but US partners in the GCC states. That will be 10 times harder a problem. With respect to the countries we're talking about in East Asia, I'll make a provocative argument, but I mean it, which is to say, sometimes we lose track of what our purpose is and what our means are for achieving that purpose. I think our primary purpose with respect to nuclear weapons is preventing use. And as a means of that, we generally feel that reducing or eliminating spread is a helpful step. And I think that's generally true. But there might be cases in which those two things diverge. And I think there's an argument to be made, actually a good argument, that it would be good for the NPT to have South Korea legally and transparently withdraw, and to do it through Article 10 of the treaty, and to explain exactly as Article 10 anticipated. Things have changed, specifically in the area of nuclear weapons, that make South Korea's national security untenable. And the reason why I think this would not only be legal and ethical, but actually good for the NPT, is if our holding on to the NPT means that a country which has abided by the rules, followed the NPT, not cheated, South Korea, is increasingly made threatened and endangered by somebody who violated the NPT and then developed a nuclear arsenal against UN Security Council resolutions, then the consequence of the treaty, the real practical consequence, is it would have made one of the good standing members of the treaty vulnerable as a result of its following the treaty. That's not good for the treaty. I think it would be better for the non-proliferation norm, and it would be better for the treaty for South Korea to say, because North Korea has violated the treaty and violated its subsequent Security Council resolutions and developed an illegal nuclear arsenal, we are legally and transparently exercising our rights under Article 10. And as soon as North Korea disarms and undergoes valid inspections, we will open negotiations to re-enter the treaty as a non-nuclear weapon state. That's the real position that I think is good for the non-proliferation norm, because the non-proliferation norm was clearly never about making upstanding members of the treaty vulnerable. And that's what it's now doing on the Korean Peninsula.
I'm going to jump in next. We're running a bit tight on time. Dr. Aoki, I'd love to hear your thoughts on non-proliferation in general. And also, that was a very provocative idea there from Dr. Press. Perhaps you could respond to that as well.
Sure. So this is not a great moment for non-proliferation in the sense that, again, Ukraine is a country that gave up nuclear weapons, Soviet era nuclear weapons, and they had a security guarantee, but it was invaded and by a nuclear armed state. So that sends all the wrong signals. This comes at a time when the inventory of nuclear weapons are going down because the United States and Russia are dismantling the retired warheads, but the overall military stockpile is going up because, and those are the ones that include the ones that go on operational forces, and because of countries like China and North Korea. So, of course, promoting non-proliferation in terms of keeping the materials out of, the wrong hands require cooperation among countries, and that the Ukrainian war obviously has undermined international cooperation in a lot of ways. So this is really not a great time for non-proliferation, but on the other hand, nuclear non-proliferation does require its cooperation is an important part of it, and so we do need to work on that, I think. And as for the NPT, that is a very interesting and an important sort of idea to think about. I am not convinced that South Korea should pull out of the NPT, and whether that is good for the non-proliferation regime, I am not convinced it is. But I think that's a really important thing to think about.
And just finally, Dr. Zhao, I know you spoke about non-proliferation in your last answer, but is there anything more you think that Washington could be doing? What did you think of South Korea pulling out of the NPT, for example?
Oh, thank you. Before going there, maybe I want to make a very brief, more general observation. I think countries develop nuclear weapons because of their deep political problems and struggles, which they couldn't resolve, which could lead to war. But nuclear weapons somehow help them maintain peace. But that made them believe they can now ignore those political problems and just do their own thing. And over time, we have arrived at a situation where the political problem has become so serious, right? The major powers, they have fundamentally opposite and divergent views on basic factual issues. They're no longer able to talk with each other, constantly talk past each other. That's why they are more relying on nuclear weapons because of their greater political problems. I think the risks of nuclear proliferation is all the symptom of the underlying political problem. It's time to seriously face and start addressing those underlying political problems. I disagree with the argument that US allies' pursuit of nuclear weapons, although they are democratic countries, I think they could address the near-term problem, but in the long run, they really undermine trust in global norms and principles. Countries like China and Russia, they already are very suspicious about Western countries' interest in always upholding these principles. If they think nuclear non-proliferation, arms control disarmament norms and principles are all meaningless, they can do great harm because there are so many other countries in the Middle East, in other regions, they want nuclear technologies, they want missile technologies that can be potentially provided by Russia or China. So I still think our really long-term security relies on building trust and confidence in global norms of proliferation and disarmament.
Thank you. That's very thoughtful. So now it's my pleasure to turn this over to Kelly Grieco of the Atlantic Council, who is going to do the Q&A section of today's event.
Thank you. I am a senior fellow with NEEI, and let me first thank Adam for leading such an engaging and insightful discussion this afternoon. And a reminder to our online audience, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom and to submit it, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. So I'm going to exercise the Q&A moderator's privilege and ask the first question. And that is, in Washington today, you hear an emerging notion that the United States needs to cultivate a tolerance for risk in order to demonstrate, it needs to demonstrate an increased willingness to accept risk in pursuit of its interests, or allies and adversaries will doubt the credibility of its commitments. And I'm wondering, if, Daryl, this is obviously right in your wheelhouse. You wrote a book around credibility. If you want to begin, what do you think of that emerging concept about, developing a tolerance for risk, and if the other panelists want to weigh in thereafter?
I'll tell you, I think it kind of gets the equation underpinning sound foreign policy strategy exactly reversed. I think that the United States should be willing to tolerate moderate risks and accept moderate costs to defend interests and allies and partners around the world that are moderately important. I think it should be willing to tolerate very large risks and pay very large costs to protect interests and allies and partners around the world who are very, very important to the United States. But I think it already does. And I think that's why we were willing to tolerate such enormous risks during the Cold War to keep Western Europe out of the clutches of the Soviet Union. I think it's why we pay lower costs and tolerate less risks to promote interests that are sincere, but which are held less dear to us than the division of the freedom of the Western European countries. The notion that we should, as a bargaining move, ante up onto the poker table very large risks, which is what we're now talking about in Korea, to defend things that we care a lot about, but which are not worth risking the survival of the United States. I think, frankly, that's a poker strategy, which might pay off for a few hands, but which leads to ruin. And that what we should really be doing is aligning costs and risks and strategy in a thoughtful way, rather than trying to pretend that every interest around the world is, in fact, something worth losing half a dozen American cities over. Some of them might be, but we should start from actual interests and then to alliances, commitments, and capabilities, rather than say, I'd like to be believed, and therefore I'm going to put everything on the table, because that's a strategy we know from Vegas. It works a few times, and then you lose your house.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists want to weigh in?
Well, I can jump in briefly. I think all the major parties' level of risk-taking is rising today because of perceived higher stakes. Right? In the case of China, it believes its regime security, its political security, is an increasing threat. It deserves, it now requires nuclear weapons, which usually didn't play a role in a political relationship, to now play a role. That, I think that's an important driver of Chinese nuclear buildup. And the US, I think, feels the entire global order is under threat. This applies also to specific disputes over Taiwan, for example. It's not only about the island, it's about American global reputation, credibility, and the future of a global order and international institutions. And for China, it's about regime security in the long run, etc. So with both sides believing the stakes are so much higher than before, certainly they will be more willing to take risks, but that doesn't solve the problem. I think collectively, that higher level of risk tolerance is only going to make future confrontations even more uncertain and hard to control and manage. Today, because of the different perceptions about causes of the troubles, US and China cannot even agree on basic nuclear risk reduction measures. right? They might believe some type of risk is beneficial to advance their self-perceived defensive objective. So still, I think it's more important that we try to mitigate their perception gap on specific disputes to try to resolve that underlying political problem first.
I may just add a very short remark about the risk tolerance. I think it's important to communicate to the allies what the U.S. is, what the tolerance level is for the United States, because part of it, as we've discussed, is the in terms of alliance management, it's the allies' perception of what the United States is willing or not willing to do that matters too.
I know for one, I don't really like when we're talking about nuclear weapons and poker is brought up. It's great comfort for Marie anyway. We have an interesting question here from one of the attendees who is asking that an idea that is out there is a notion that there might maybe NATO or the US could offer some kind of deal to Russia to try to terminate the war, in which the US would agree to remove nuclear weapons from Europe in exchange, so that Putin could have some reason to declare a victory and to terminate the war. Sort of a two-part question. One, how do you assess this idea? And I think second would be, what might China or our allies in the Indo-Pacific learn from that kind of decision, if it were to be made? Daryl, if you want to go first, and then
I think this is, in my opinion, so the times are strange, the times are difficult, so we should be doing exactly what the questioner is asking, which is putting everything on the table and asking ourselves how we can solve this. But in my mind, the months after a nuclear armed country invades a non-nuclear country and uses nuclear threats to limit the conventional intervention of the US and NATO would be the wrong time to withdraw NATO nuclear forces from Europe. I think that would be a bit of a disaster. And I think it would trigger the sort of proliferation dynamics that we've been talking about in East Asia across Eastern Europe. So I would not sign on to that. I think we tend to talk in abstractions, and maybe I aided that by talking about poker or something like this. But I really think we have to focus on the core of the problem we face. The core of the problem we face, I believe, is not misunderstanding. It's not that the South Koreans mistakenly are doubting US credibility. It's that they're understanding the truth. And the truth is, pledging to stand shoulder to shoulder with our South Korean allies at the potential risk of the loss of a few thousand American soldiers in a war on the peninsula, I think that was a fully credible commitment. And I think South Koreans did too. Telling South Koreans that we're going to exchange a half dozen or a dozen nuclear weapons with the North Koreans because North Korea has used a nuclear weapon against South Korea. Any South Korean who thinks about this for 10 minutes, they're going to say, it's the old question, would the United States willingly trade Los Angeles for Pyongyang? And I think it's really hard to make the case that we should or that we would, especially as North Korean nuclear capabilities grow. So honestly, and just to try to make this concrete, I don't think the problem we're facing is one of messaging. I don't think the problem we face is one of misunderstanding. The problem is that North Korea has adopted a smart strategy. They now hold the US and increasingly hold the US homeland at risk. And so South Koreans should be thinking hard about how do we replace the protection we had been getting from a now less credible US nuclear deterrent. And they're a sovereign country and they could decide we don't want to replace that. And that's their right. But if they needed the US nuclear deterrent before faced by North Korean nuclear threats, I think a lot of South Koreans will decide they don't want to rely on the trust, but do still want to rely on a credible nuclear deterrent. And that's probably going to have to be controlled in Seoul.
Dr. Aoki or Dr. Zhao, do you want to add?
Sure. So I think there are, for the South Koreans to go nuclear, so I'm going to point out some of the disadvantages, some of the cons, which even if it legally pulls out of the NPT, say it doesn't face enormous economic sanctions, there will be, well, okay, so if it legally pulls out of the NPT and it is, that is considered legitimate, maybe it won't suffer as much diplomatic costs or economic costs, but there will be, as in the Japan's case, there will be a time between the time when they decide to do this and then when they actually have a force capable of defending itself. So what happens during that time matters, and what the United States does in that time matters too. So is the United States going to continue offering a security guarantee during that time? There are a lot of questions to consider for that option.
Okay. Well, I'm actually, Dr. Zhao, this is a question for you that someone asked, which was, if Russia were to conduct some kind of nuclear demonstration or use a tactical nuclear weapon, it was asked sort of how NATO, the US might respond, but I'm going to just change it a little bit and say, how would China respond actually to a use of a nuclear weapon or even a tactical nuclear weapon by Russia in the Ukraine conflict?
I think firstly, I'm going to challenge this question, but because I think China genuinely tend to dismiss the risk of Russian nuclear threat. Right? China is very sympathetic to the Russian thinking and narrative, and believe that this war is a result of Western and especially NATO problems and mistakes. And their willingness to address, so-called legitimate interests of Russia. And Russia is simply using their own advantage, which is their big nuclear arsenal, to try to deter and dissuade Western involvement in the war as much as possible. I think it's understandable from the Chinese perspective in terms of Russian nuclear saber rattling. If it came to the point that Russia did do a nuclear demonstration, I think for the reasons I just explained, I wouldn't expect China to fundamentally change its position and start to really side with US and Western countries to criticize, let alone punish Russia. Certainly, I think if China is deeply worried if a war over Ukraine could escalate across the nuclear threshold, it would introduce a lot of geopolitical uncertainty that will deeply affect China's near-term and long-term security landscape. But in the near term, I think China still will take a more ambiguous position, at least will not be as strong to criticize Russian nuclear use as other countries.
Thank you. And as we're closing in towards the end of our hour here, we have a really great question from Daniel Post, which is sort of a bigger concepts question, which is, how should scholars and practitioners of strategic deterrence really be thinking about deterrence today? How is it different today than in the past during the Cold War? What would you say to policymakers that they should really be thinking about in this era? And Dr. Aoki, if you want to go first this time, that would be great.
Sure. I think there's a lot of continuity, I think, in terms of thinking about deterrence. And I think there is a lot of there have been misunderstandings between nuclear deterrence and what nuclear deterrence does. That does not prevent conventional attack, or sometimes, as it was discussed in this hour in our talk here, it could exacerbate conventional warfare. So I think it's important to be clear about what nuclear deterrence does and does not do. And I think that the importance of that is still very significant.
And then we'll close out with Dr. Press.
I think the question is great. And again, my overarching point is not that South Korea should or should not get nuclear weapons. That's South Korea's decision. It's that along the lines of what Mr. Post said, is that all these questions about how to practice extended nuclear deterrence, how to prevent proliferation, when we shouldn't try to prevent proliferation, these are all very alive and very new questions. And we should be interrogating the entire list of policy tools that we used in the past to try to prevent proliferation and extend deterrence, and reevaluate which might be appropriate in Eastern Europe, which might be appropriate in East Asia, and around the corner, which might be appropriate on the Persian Gulf.
Dr. Zhao?
I think I will just say that it's time for us to realize that deterrence is just a technical level tool to try to address and manage a political level problem. And for deterrence to be effective, we have to take risks. And as the political struggles become more serious, the risk will raise. Maybe perhaps to a point where a technical tool is no longer possible to completely contain all the risks of escalation and war consequences. Again, going back to my point, now it's time to really face and acknowledge and address underlying political problems, and not solely relying on deterrence to help save us.
Thank you. That's a wonderful place to end. And I want to thank our moderator again, and also our panelists for what I found to be a really rich and insightful discussion of what are really inherently very complex issues. And I appreciate our panelists in particular for drawing out some of the nuances. So thank you as well to our audience at home. I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation. And if there's one, I think, takeaway from today, it's probably that we're all a little out of practice, perhaps, around the vocabulary and the concepts of nuclear deterrence, but it's urgently needed that we sort of regain that capacity. And so hopefully we've started that again today. Thank you.